Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. And of course, you got to always acknowledge my cohort, Clyde. And I see you using the chat, the new chat in the Consciousness Raising too. Thank you. For anybody who's watching this live, you can uh, put messages in on the chat at consciousnessraisingonline.com. And if you're watching it and you still got the window up over at Destiny.com, you can use that as well. I can see both of them. Um, Now, for some, oh, okay, thank you. Destiny said you can use either one, both of them work good. Y'all is too slick with this technology. Uh, um, Today's session is called From Slavery to Nova Scotia, and you'll understand why it's named that. We're going to take a walk through some history. And I think I'm almost positive you're going to be very surprised at some of the things we're going to cover today. Um, when I was a child growing up, I would always, a lot of times, I'd be saying, you know, uh, I was some kind of way I got the phrase Nova Scotia in my head, and I never went and looked it up back then. I just say, oh, go on to Nova Scotia, and I didn't realize then that Nova Scotia has a very um, um, very direct connection to Black folks here in uh, in the United States. First of all, I thought Nova Scotia was somewhere in another continent, you know. So if you never really knew where Nova Scotia is, you're going to learn some things about Nova Scotia today, which I think you'll find very interesting. Um, the other thing is this: as you look at this graphic, one of the things we're so arrogant about in the United States, in fact, we tend to call us America, and as if there's not a South America, and as if there's not a huge country north of us, which is part of North America, as well as a huge country beneath us, which is called Mexico. But how many of us really understand that how much bigger Canada is? And that's why I put this graphic up here so you can see Canada is huge. In fact, it is actually bigger than the continental United States, than the 48 states. Yeah, it is. It's also two parts. It's one part is French Canada, and the other part is British Canada. And what? Let me show you again in a different graph. Um, you see how big it is? It's huge. Uh, there's China and Australia and Brazil and Russia, but we don't think of Canada as being, in fact, most of us have no clue of how big Canada is. So that's going to become very important over the next few minutes. Now, one of the things that we also don't really know a lot about is the Revolutionary War. Now, we know the stuff about Washington sailing on the Potomac and some little stuff, right? But it's some very unique things that occurred in the Revolutionary War. Um, in the Revolutionary War, the British, and for those that don't recall, it was the Revolutionary War was these folks who had come over here, these Europeans, they decided to break away from Britain because Britain, had claimed a new country, right? And so this war broke out, a Revolutionary War to establish America, the United States. Uh, but now, what one of the things that occurred, because they already had slavery, okay, there was already slavery in a bunch of states, not just the slave states in the South, but also in New York other areas. The British made a deal with the enslaved Africans. They said, any of you all who escaped from slavery, from the slave states, and come and fight with us, then we will free you. You'll be free after the war. And they were called loyalists, black loyalists. And so a bunch of them did, or at least 10,000, probably more than that, but at least 10,000 enslaved Africans um, escaped and fought with the British. Now, what occurred was that in the Revolutionary War, uh, they were rewarded, these black loyalists, they were rewarded by being transported to Canada, to a place called Nova Scotia. All right. Now, understand the first African person in Nova Scotia arrived with the founding of Port Royal in 1605. And then African people were then brought to Nova Scotia uh, to Nova Scotia during the American Revolution. All right. So uh, now other black loyalists were transported to settlements in several islands in the West Indies and some to London. And what occurred was that these black loyalists were recorded in a book called the Book of Negroes. And not too a few years ago, there was even a movie or something made about it, the Book of Negroes. But this was the list of all the black folks who had escaped and fought with the British. You know, one of the things that the United States tried to do was get them back. um, Now, the it's the former enslaved Africans who were recorded in the Book of Negroes. They were evacuated to British North America, where they were settled in a newly established Birchtown, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, and other places in the colony. Now, according to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States argued for the return of all property, including slaves, and the British refused to return them because they had promised them freedom for joining their cause. Okay? And so, like I say, they were settled in a town called Birchtown, which was started by Samuel Birch. Birchtown in Nova Scotia. But I want you to look real quick at the war timeline because, see, we need to understand some things. There was some deep stuff went on. Okay, 1775. Some of these dates and stuff might ring a bell from high school, or whatever. The Battle of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, the Battle of Bunker Hill. 1776, of course, George Washington took command of the Army, but also the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. That's why they, always had that bicentennial and all that stuff, right? The Americans won the Battle of Saratoga, but they lost the capital at Philadelphia, and they almost died out at Valley Forge. 1778, France gave the rebels supplies and men. 1779, the war shifted to the southern colonies. The British tried to divide the colonies. That's when they really went tough in terms of saying to the enslaved Africans, come on and join us, fight with us, and you'll be free. Okay. 1780, guerrilla warfare, Americans win at Kings Mountain, etc., etc., etc. The French and Americans forced Cornwallis to surrender Yorktown, Virginia. That was 1781. And in 1783, Americans and British signed the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. Okay? Now, that has some serious significance, which I'll come to in a second. Um, Now, after the War of Independence, uh, you see the black loyalists were relocated to up into Nova Scotia, which is part of Canada. Okay. Now remember, the war ended in 1783 when they signed the agreement in Paris. And the Africans who had been moved up to Nova Scotia, it became like Birchtown became like a place of refuge. And they also had free black folks up there too. Because a lot was going on. Not only were these escaped Africans uh, relocated up there, but also uh, Africans who had escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad. They also were located up there. Okay, so there's a lot of activity in this area called Nova Scotia. I was like really outdone. I said, "Where? How did all of this occur?" And I, I couldn't ever recall reading anything about this in the history books. Nothing. Now I want you to look at this real close. Black loyalist settlements. Okay, they had communities and landing places. Shelburne, St. John, Port Mouton, Annapolis Royal, Halifax, Port Cumberland. And you see these areas here. Okay. All right, down at the bottom, you'll see where it says Birchtown, Port Moulton, or Mountain, I guess Moulton, and Shelburne. Let me tell you about Shelburne, because some deep stuff happened in Shelburne. Um, Shelburne was one of the places where, where black folks went. And there were a lot, as many as 3,000 or better Africans were in Shelburne County. The majority of these were in Birchtown. And this was the largest community of free black folks anywhere in North America. Ain't that deep? This is up in Nova Scotia. The largest community of free blacks in North America. That means in terms of the United States and Mexico, all of that. Now, one of the things they did find out though, that the freedom was not really uh, all that they thought it would be. They were supposed to get land grants promised by the British. They were delayed quite a bit of time, and they were smaller and in worse locations than those that were given to the white loyalists. And so, with few possessions and no land, many of the black settlers were forced into indentured servitude, which really looked a lot like slavery. And some cases, in some cases, free black folks were kidnapped and what? Sold back into slavery in the United States or even down in the Caribbean. See, no rest for the weary, no rest. Now, even though it never became a plantation economy, uh, Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia was definitely a slave-owning society. And then after the Revolution, these white loyalists, they carried at least 15,000 enslaved Africans to various corners of the British Empire. So, in Shelburne County, white dissatisfaction toward the British was often directed towards who? The black folks, of course. And the white refugees who came up there, they were facing delays too, and they blamed it on the black folks. And a lot of them had to end up hiring themselves out as laborers, and they resented having, number one, to work next to or work in competition with the Africans. And so finally, things got to a head. And July of 1784. Now remember, this is just 1 year later after what's the Paris uh, uh, peace accords, where they ended the war, right? So now here we are, the next year in Birchtown. Uh, mob Mobs of loyalist white settlers stormed the home of a black preacher in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, armed with hooks and chains that they got from the ships in the harbor. The majority of the attacks targeted the county's free black population, and so the Shelburne riot has been described as the first race riot in North America. Um, so, Shelburne County had sprung up because of black folks, right? That was really ugly because they went on for at least 10 days, and even then sporadic stuff jumped off even more over the next month. They tore down they tore down at least 20 other houses of free black folks. So they did what we saw them do in the United States as well. They would go after black folks who were doing well. Okay? Now, that was 1784. What we probably have forgotten, because I remember something about it, but I don't remember much about it until I was doing the research. Most of us think that the Revolutionary War, was the end of the battle with the British. Uh-uh. Uh-uh. Why did I say that? Because you remember a war called the War of 1812? The War of 1812. Yeah, that was with the British. Um, Now, the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain also resulted in another era of significant migration. Roughly 2,000 black refugees seeking freedom, because they did the same thing. They say, hey, if you help fight with us, the British, we'll evacuate you out of the United States. And so they sent another 2,000 up to Nova Scotia between 1813 and 1816. Many of them settled in Halifax and Dartmouth, including two large groups in Hammonds Plain and Preston. Others went to smaller communities: 5 Mile Plains, Beachville, Porter's Lake, Fletcher's Lake, Prospect Road, Beaver Bank, Avonport, Pine Woods, and Mill Village. Now, probably the Canadian folks watching this will know what I'm talking about. But I didn't even realize that the War of 1812 was about the British and the United States fighting again. And look here, uh, the British did some serious damage. Check this out. Because now this, some things you may recall from history classes. But now look at this. In the War of 1812, the British put a blockade. You see these ships with the red arrow, right? Go to the bottom of the red arrow and go all the way down here to the Gulf of Mexico. You see these ships? These little things with the 4 little circles? Now look at that. They did a blockade from down to New Orleans all the way up to Massachusetts. Look at those ships. They did a blockade, right? and they took Detroit, uh, the Niagara campaign. That's number 5. That was a big campaign, and they sacked Washington D.C. They went and burned Washington D.C. Okay, and there's Fort McHenry, and then there was the Battle of New Orleans. See, all of that happened in in the War of 1812. And if you look, you see that the United States at that time, see all that unorganized territory. There was Illinois territory, Indiana territory, Michigan. Fort Dearborn was what was where Chicago is today. But it was just this part, the eastern part. Florida was still Spanish. Okay, and then you had British North America, Canada. All right, look up there at the top. You'll see Montreal, right? And in New York, where you have, Ontario, stuff like that. And of course, what is it? Niagara Falls is up there. That's in part of it's in New York and part of it's in Canada, right? So this was a big battle. And again, they moved the black folks, took some of them and sent them when they fought for them. They moved them to Canada. Now, just for a hot second, let me show you this closer up, or go over some of this. The War of 1812, because this was so big. Now they started fighting, and they had a big old battle. Went all the way to what is it, 1816, 1815, 1816. And so you can come back and look at this at your leisure. But the steamship helped, the steamboat that helped the United States to win. But there was a bunch of stuff happened. James Monroe. See all these names? Louisiana became April 30th, 1812. Louisiana becomes the 18th state to enter the United States of America. Uh, and they fought out Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. They was a fighting. Now, here's where some things really, really got ugly for us. In 1848, the first black settlers bought land in an area that came to be known as Africville, Afrique, as in Africa, Africville. And the original 5 land purchases were made by 5 families: Arnold, Brown, Cavalry, Fletcher, and Hill. But it wasn't until 1866 that the term Africville was used for the first time on a land deed. It was earlier referred to as Campbelltown and the Black Settlement. Now, from the beginning, the white folks, they didn't like this. Into something. This is an independent little black town. Now, because they were in settlements in other areas, but they shared that, this was the first one that was, from what I understand, was all black. Um, so the north, this was in the north end of Halifax. And so the white folks basically systematically tried to destroy Africville. Um, they wanted to develop Africville for industry, and that meant trying to kick out the black people who lived there. And they went after them in ways that were like really crappy. They put a hospital for diseased World War II veterans there at one point, that they had contagious viruses and stuff. Then they put up a toxic waste dump. They promised to provide basic amenities and services like sewage and stuff like that. Never did it. Uh, Dig this. This is from actual report. The hospital would just dump their raw sewage on the dump, bloody body parts, blankets, and everything. And then they would burn this dump every so often. And there would be walls of fire and toxic smoke. And we used to run through that fire to get to the metals before they melted because we scavenged off the dump. We had to. You had to do that to survive. There was also the rats. The estimates were about 100,000 rats at any given time. The rat population grew to such a point where if you came out at night with a flashlight, it looked like the dump was alive. It looked like a rug. Ugh. And I have a personal experience that that I can relate to that. I used to, at one time, I was a movie reviewer. Um, I was one of the very few black folks in the United States that was a certified movie reviewer. What that meant was that I had a pass that allowed me to go to any of these shows, any of these theaters in this chain, the biggest chain at the time in the United States and Canada. I could go there anytime, being a guest. Didn't matter whether it was when it was. Okay. In fact, a few times I would go, obviously in other cities, and I would go and I would go to the show, and invariably, whoever was at the front would have to take this and go ask their manager, "Is this valid?" And I knew what they were saying. It's a black guy out here. He says he got a pass that allows me to go to any movie. They would call up to, because the base of the company was in Canada. And they would call up there, and they would verify, yeah, he's a certified reviewer. Anyway, one of the other things is that I used to go to press junkets, and this is where they would fly you either to LA or to New York, put you up in a four-star hotel, and you would get to interview the stars of a movie over the next 3 or 4 days. And when I say four-star hotel, I mean we weren't allowed to tip, none of that. All of that was taken care of. Get whatever food we wanted, whatever. Well, one time when went to New York, I was in Manhattan, four-star hotel, and I wanted to go out. It was getting towards evening, so I was gonna go. I guess I was just gonna go out and see what was around in Manhattan, right? And so I asked the concierge where was a good place maybe to get a to eat and whatever. He said, "Well, a lot of places, but you might not want to go out there." And I said, "Why?" He said, well, you'll see." So I go out there, right? And it's dusk. It's dusk. And in the shadows down the street, I see something move across the street. Said, "Damn, what was that?" I thought maybe it was a bunch of cats or dogs or something, but they didn't bark, didn't meow. So I'm looking, and then all of a sudden, went back across the street, this whole movement. And that's when I realized these were rats. It was like, I don't know how many hundreds of them. And see, in New York, they don't have alleys. They put the trash and the garbage out in front, in garbage cans out in front of the buildings. And so, come dusk, that's when the rat population, they go to feast. Man, look here. When I saw them do that again, and they seem to be moving closer to where I was, even though it's still at least a block away, but it was that visible. And I saw them do that charge across the street again. I said, "Oh, hell no." I went back in the hotel. I didn't leave the hotel again until the day I left. Ran out and got in a limo to go to the airport. I was like, "Oh, no, 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 no." I'm telling you, that was some scary stuff. So when they talk about it in Afriqueville, that they had hundreds of thousands of rats and they're eating in the dump and all of that. And they had children. That was some cruel stuff they did. Um, Now, finally, after at least when they had the rat population get so large, the city uh, sent exterminators to dump rat poison in the dump. So that was in the air. It was in the air. It got on their clothes, and they said some studies showed that they had a high incidence of cancer breakout. Now that still didn't cause a mass exodus. They couldn't get the black folks to leave. So finally, Halifax officially declared Afriqueville to be a slum, an uninhabitable slum. And then they started to force the people out and put them in public housing. And they used something called eminent domain. Yeah. So now, where the people had been living there, owning their homes, now they were put in public housing where they had to pay rent. Ain't that something? And all the way down to 1964, they finally gave some people a little bit of compensation, people that just refused to move, even though the town was like, by that time, it was just totally uninhabitable. And then they started bulldozing. In fact, they started bulldozing the houses even when people were still living in them. And then they tore down the church. And finally, by 1969, that was the end of Freakville. Uh, and during this period, they were calling it urban renewal. That was strange because in places like Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, Baltimore, uh, they also had programs called urban renewal. We called it urban removal. Uh, they did ugly stuff. When they were evicting people, sometimes they were using city dump trucks to put people's furniture and stuff in when they would evict them. And the last person to leave, December 30th, 1969, they demolished the town and they put up Seaview Park, which some people in Canada may recognize. Seaview Park. In 1996, Heritage Canada designated Afriqueville a National Historic Site, recognizing the location as a tribute to the African Canadian community. And then finally in 2010, the city of Halifax offered a formal apology to the residents and descendants of Afriqueville, and they gave up in this settlement 1 hectare of land on the former community site to rebuild the community church and 3 million towards building this church. So they built a replica, and that's what you see in some of these graphics. They built a replica of the church. But Afriqueville never came back. When I learned of this, and actually I did a presentation on Afriqueville years ago, I was just too outdone, but I didn't know the whole history. All I knew is the history of Afriqueville. There's the replica church. And I was heartbroken. These were independent black folks, you know? But now here's where it really gets deep. There's been this thing for a while about about the national pastime in Canada. Oh, by the way, that's a stamp that you're looking at right there. Africville stamp, 1963. Okay, the national pastime of Canada. What would you say it is? Can we agree that is hockey, ice hockey? And in our understanding, hockey is a white man's sport. Well, let's see. A couple of things is wrong with that picture. One is ice hockey was actually started by Native Americans. And then, believe it or not, uh, inspired by all black baseball leagues, which were formed in the Canadian Maritimes, the Colored Hockey League was established in 1895 by Baptist ministers in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And they did it to boost church attendance among the community's young black men, primarily the descendants of enslaved Africans who had sought sanctuary in Canada through the Underground Railroad, as well as immigrants from the British colonies, because some of them came from the British colonies in the Caribbean up to Halifax. And of course, some of them were also descendants of the Africans who had been brought up there by the British. Dig this, with as many as a dozen teams, over 400 African Canadian players from across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island participated in competition. The Colored Hockey League is credited as being the first league to allow the goaltender to leave his feet to cover a puck in 1900, meaning that they could spread out they could get down or lay down to block pucks. And this was not permitted elsewhere until the formation of the National Hockey League in 1917. And also, the first player to use the slap shot was a brother named Eddie Martin of the Halifax Eureka in 1906. And the slap shot is like key to ice hockey. Now, what's so ugly? Now you had all these black folks, these black players in the black leagues. And you say, well, what happened? Same thing happened with baseball. Okay? The white owners of the white teams, they saw that the black players, the black teams, or the colored league, they were much more exciting. And so what they did, they started hiring some of the players and started integrating, as they called it, integrating the league until the colored league basically uh, became extinguished in about I think the late 1920s, maybe 1930. And then to make it worse, they got rid of the black players that they had brought into the leagues. And so maybe one or two or three, there might have been a few black folks, but very, very few black players in the National Hockey League. And that's still to this day. You have a few, but you don't have nothing near what was back then. Ain't that something? And they buried this history, buried it, because most of us in this country have no clue that there was a quote, colored hockey league. In fact, From what I understand, there's a lot of folks in Canada that don't know it. And they'll say, oh, hockey's a white man's sport. And, black people, they can't really skate too well, and they don't like the cold and all of that. These brothers is up there playing their behinds off. They helped. What they did was they brought into the game certain things that brought excitement to the game and advanced ice hockey to where it is today. And the same thing happened in basketball. Brothers brought excitement to the game. Same thing with baseball. Brothers brought excitement to the game. Football, same thing. Brothers brought excitement to the game. So that's that's some Canadian history that has been um, hidden, buried, buried. Yep. Now, just for our own sake, I'm going to take a second here to look at um, Canada, because, like I say, it's bigger. It's so much bigger than we can imagine. And so, remember, I said part of it is French Canadian, part of it is British. So you have, okay, over here on the right hand side, where you have the pink, Quebec, and somebody can probably do it better than me, but I just want to point out certain things because you have Quebec, you have Ontario, you have Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, you have the Yukon, you have the Northwest Territories, you have Nunavut, and I don't know how you say it, equality, something. But all of this is Canada. You have Newfoundland, Labrador, and of course Nova Scotia, and all of that. New Brunswick, all of that. It's amazing. And we have so little knowledge of Canada. And like I say, most Americans, most United States citizens, if you ask them, they say, oh, yeah, little Canada. They think that the United States is huge, much, much, much bigger than Canada. But Canada has always kept a low profile when it comes to the United States. But between Canada and Mexico, they're the two largest trading partners of the United States. You know, that should not be ignored. So I'm going to close out now, and I will leave you with some of the what happened here? Some of the oh, I see what happened. Some of the shots we use, so you can have that for yourself, and possibly spur some research of your own, and you may even find out you got relatives in Canada. I have found that I have some friends in Canada. In fact, a friend of mine who sent me this shirt I was wearing earlier. I still got it on, just can't see me. But she grew up at one point when we were kids. We were teenagers on the south side of Chicago, and I didn't see her for many, many years. And come to find out, she had moved to Canada, been there for years and years and years. All right, thank you, Clyde. Um, and for those who, I love this gift right here. That's so cute, isn't it? All right, but in any case, I want you to have a fantastic new year, and we're going to continue to grow and learn and share with each other. And of course, I always say, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.